So how does MDMA work in comparison to an SSRI and in comparison to something like LSD?
Yeah. Um, so MDMA is again a very difficult drug because it does a lot of things. Um, in a way, it's a little bit closer to an SSRI than a psychedelics or classical psychedelics because it's not necessarily stimulating the receptors that much itself, but it's rather releasing serotonin. So the serotonin you again have in your brain already gets released into the synaptic cleft, so the space between the neurons, and then can stimulate the neurons that are on the other side of the synaptic cleft. However, it is not only doing that to serotonin, but it's also doing that for dopamine and for norepinephrine, for example. So
Mm.
it's a very complicated drug pharmacologically, but it's more of a releaser than stimulating the receptors themselves. It does that a little bit too, but much less than a classical psychedelic. So again, a pretty different mechanism of action here. And you're perfectly right. So the social aspects are definitely the ones that people look at when we're talking about MDMA because they are just so prominent, right? But we have done, not necessarily comparison studies, but I've written up a review paper where we compared the studies that have been conducted with MDMA on the social aspects, and the studies that have been conducted with psilocybin and LSD. And what we see there when we compare these results is that the social or the increases in empathy and the changes in other aspects of social processing are actually pretty similar in MDMA and in classical psychedelics. So my interpretation here is that, well, maybe we just don't talk about the social effects of psychedelics that much because when people take them, the first thing they notice is obviously all these alterations in their visual system and the sensory system that you know somewhere underneath the whole social changes and social perception happen, but they're just not as obvious, because maybe they're just
Hmm.
because all this other thing is going on as well, and that is also a lot easier to describe, for example. um, but yeah, when we look at the data, the alterations in social processing are to a degree pretty similar, to the ones of MDMA.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the flip side of that too is with MDMA, people focus so much on the social and empathic behavioral effects that they sometimes overlook the sensory effects. There definitely are sensory effects, I would say. What do we know, if anything, about that scientifically?
Not so much to my knowledge right now, because usually people have, alterations in sensory experiences mostly at pretty high doses of MDMA. And obviously, we need to make sure in the experiments that we are conducting that, yeah, that we keep our participants safe. So
Hmm.
we tend to administer, doses which are like in a moderate range, right?
Hmm.
Um, there is a bit of research on MDMA and social touch. So how, that you perceive, the touch of another person in a different, usually more pleasant way. But I'm not aware of much research going on like visual effects of MDMA, for example, because they're just not as reliably induced, at least in low to moderate doses, with MDMA compared to, for example, psilocybin.
Gotcha. So something like LSD or psilocybin is directly stimulating certain serotonin receptors in the brain. That's causing all of the psychedelic effects. MDMA is not doing that. It's really dumping serotonin and other transmitters into the synaptic space more. So you've sort of got more of these neurotransmitters in the brain doing stuff. And so, in that sense, it's sort of like an SSRI. An SSRI and MDMA would put more serotonin into the synaptic space. So, what's the interaction or the potential danger of having an SSRI in your system when you take MDMA?
Yeah, that's a good question, and can basically only give you the same answer I gave you before. That right now at least we just don't know. I mean, there's always the problem that with the serotonin syndrome, right? So
Hmm.
too much serotonin really is not good for you. Um, so it's probably not something that people should try. Even more so with MDMA. It's just probably not a good idea to kind of overload your serotonin system that much. But we just don't know at this moment, right? There will be, I'm pretty sure there are some studies going on or will be going on in the near future where we will have scientific data on that, and where people are doing these experiments in a safe setting.